Welcome to the Be Global by Design podcast, where we talk to creatives and change makers from around the world about the importance of arts, culture, and design to creating communities where we all want to live. I'm joined today by Ben Stone, who was formerly with the National Endowment of Arts and is an expert in community arts design, including placemaking. Welcome, Ben. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you are now?
Sure. So my background is in the visual arts and urban planning. I've always had a foot in each of those two worlds. Went to art school a long time ago, worked as a public artist, made art, ran art programs for a number of years, and then went back to school. Once I realized my interest is really in community engagement, mapping, thinking about neighborhoods, and have been in between those worlds ever since. Worked for city agencies, with state agencies, most recently the federal government, National Endowment for the Arts. I'm now out on my own as a consultant, like so many other former federal staff members.
What impact do you think creatives and designers have on community development?
Quite a bit. It sort of depends on one's perspective. I'd say everything from being often the first folks into revitalizing neighborhoods for a number of reasons. Artists are often folks who are highly educated but lower income, and are often in neighborhoods where change is happening. They're very visible just by the nature of being an artist. If you are an artist, you are often creating things that are visual and visible and need attention at a certain point when you're trying to sell whatever it is, your performance or visual arts. So that tends to bring more attention than a lot of other professions do to changing neighborhoods. But artists are often just engaged in their communities because they're drawing inspiration from their communities and so are engaged as elected officials, sometimes running for office, neighborhood organizers, because they're relying on lots of people around them to find spaces to work and to collaborate with to make the work they're looking to create, and therefore get engaged in the community development sphere as a result of just their own work.
And how does that work contribute to economic growth, social impact, cultural transformation from your experience?
It depends on the role of the artist. I'd say many neighborhoods are looking for something that'll change the perception of the neighborhood and draw folks in, certainly in commercial corridors and those kinds of neighborhoods. And artists, just by the nature of producing work and showing it in a gallery, producing work, showing it in a theater, are drawing crowds on any given night to then experience that hopefully positive experience, which can really change the way people think about an area. So I think that is kind of the most fundamental way they're changing the perception of an area. Um, but artists also are like so many other people, working people. They need spaces to create their work. They need schools to send their kids to or to attend themselves. They need basic services. So they're engaged in that way as well.
Can you share with me a success story of where you saw artists or placemaking or some sort of coming together of a community to really promote arts and how that changed a city or a area, neighborhood?
Yeah, I can share the story of my own experience in my own hometown of Baltimore. I ran the Station North Arts District here for a number of years, an area right in the center of the city that I often describe as, if you're, well, like me, a planner, or really anyone who pays attention to cities and look at a map of assets in Baltimore, it's the kind of area you'd think would be maybe the most thriving. Johns Hopkins University is there, Maryland Institute College of Art, University of Baltimore, the main transportation hub, Penn Station is right there. A trail network, several trail networks actually pass through there, light rail, et cetera. It's kind of got all the stuff you would need to make a neighborhood thrive in many, from many perspectives. A lot of it just wasn't working. It wasn't coming together. The vacancy rate when I was working there, starting working there in 2011, I guess it was above 50%. So the majority of
Okay.
buildings are actually empty. And there's lots of reasons for that, historic reasons and redlining reasons, and lots of things had gone wrong by intention, I guess you could say. But it hadn't come back together despite all those assets I mentioned before. And the one thing that was kind of nudging the direction, the positive direction, was a group of artists working in the neighborhood and revitalizing buildings, moving into vacant spaces, and creating work, performing things of that sort that was really making positive momentum happen when other folks were kind of moving away and moving the opposite direction. So that was an important indication that there was a market there. for cultural production, for people living. And as soon as folks started doing that, creating work there, they were then interested in finding other things to work. And a public school opened as a result, and a lot of things came together as a result of that work.
So I think it's interesting because what you're saying isn't that did nobody came and just gave you a whole pile of money to do this, right? It was really kind of a grassroots effort. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's hard to quote unquote do it. It's the result. Well, my role, I should say, I won't take full credit. I didn't create the district or anything. It certainly didn't ask the artists to move there. This was really people looking for affordable places to live and work. They were looking for access to DC and New York through the train. They were looking for the kinds of spaces that many artists are looking for, certainly back then when it was not, quite as many people working digitally. But sculptors are looking for large spaces. There's a lot of industrial spaces. This is a neighborhood where the bottle cap was first invented and produced. So lots of big industrial buildings that were
Okay.
empty there, which made for the kind of spaces that artists wanted to make work in. So that happened kind of naturally. It was definitely a naturally occurring cultural district, as many folks call these places. And the state's involvement and then the city's involvement, eventually my involvement through my nonprofit was a result of noticing all that happening and trying to support it and grow it and help the artists continue to thrive in the neighborhood rather than looking at a bunch of vacant buildings and saying, what would be really great here would be a bunch of artists moving in. That, in my experience, never really works. It never works in the long term. It can work maybe short term with some free space offered, but it doesn't usually change a neighborhood in the way people want it to. Whereas working with existing assets and growing them and supporting them is a much better approach.
So what was the argument you made? How did you attract people and bring them together sort of around this idea?
Um, Depended on who I was talking to. That's always my first answer. For me, I'd say it worked in the sense that I was often talking to funders, as anyone who runs a nonprofit is doing. And for those folks, I think many of the people who'd been around in the area, just like me, were aware that like I said before, the one thing that was moving forward in a positive kind of way was the fact that artists were moving into the area and renovating buildings and opening businesses and just pushing things in a positive direction. They understood that and recognized that, generally speaking, the quote unquote market does not really support artists in the way they need to be supported. They often need subsidy through philanthropy, through public funding, any other number of different sources to make that work. So they understood that and supported things in that.
Okay. And what what's it like now? What happened? What is it like vacancy rates and other things?
Yeah, I mean, like many neighborhoods, it's not a total upward trajectory and simple story. There's been a lot
Sure.
going on in the last few years to say the
Yeah.
least. The Freddie Gray uprising in Baltimore, a lot of that took place in the neighborhood, and that in some ways brought people together, in other ways really harmed a lot of progress. Things I think are better off now than they were before that, for sure. The certain crime rates and violence rates have gone way down since then, but it's been a bit of a journey to get there. The pandemic was hard on any commercial corridor
Sure.
anywhere in the country, especially
Yeah.
those that involve movie theaters and live theater and just places that bring people together. So some of those spaces have closed, bars, restaurants, theaters. Others have opened, but it's not like it's totally moving forward an upward trajectory. So the one thing that's really changed is ownership has changed. It's more nonprofit, mission-based organizations rather than for-profit owners, which is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just kind of a shift that's happened. But many more buildings are in the hands of creative people and nonprofits that answer to a board and to a mission that is related to revitalizing the neighborhood and supporting the artists who are there.
So it sounds like, I mean, life happens and there's like a lot of different factors, but it sounds as if the work that you did and really bringing creatives together and creating sort of an ecosystem does impact crime rates. It does impact housing. It brings people in. It changes the way that the community feels about the community they live in and the ownership that they take. And once you take ownership, it kind of builds up a sense of wanting to help it succeed.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely true. I'd say one other way I describe the work is that much of the work I was involved in was running a mural festival, putting on outdoor performances, renovating outdoor spaces for performances, indoor spaces for theater, things like that. And a lot of that was very visible. And I'd often describe that work as kind of being the outward edge of the change that was happening in the neighborhood, as the kind of things that people could see if you were a resident living in this neighborhood in a row house looking out your window and seeing a mural painted outside. You probably would notice that much more than you would maybe notice the meetings that are happening behind closed doors to talk about zoning changes or major redevelopment of the parking lot next to Penn Station, which is still hopefully in the works. So that kind of change is often invisible to the average person, but painting a mural, running a festival outside is very visible, and it's kind of a gateway drug to getting people involved in neighborhood change. You know, people have opinions about murals. They'll often come out and tell you about them, complain about them. At the end of the day, a mural can be painted over. But I always use those sorts of things to say, okay, well, you didn't like this mural. Hopefully, you did like the mural. But if you didn't like the mural, you can come to your neighborhood association meeting where a lot of decisions are made about public art and things of that sort. And by the way, they're also going to have a vote on whether or not the neighborhood should support this major redevelopment in your neighborhood that you probably know nothing about. And that was pretty effective way of getting people just more organized and aware of how
Interesting.
the levers of change actually operate in a neighborhood.
That's awesome. Can you talk a little bit about what I think most people traditionally know as placemaking and a little bit of, I guess I'm asking you two questions in one, but maybe to back up, talk a little bit about your role at the National Endowment of the Arts and then what that had to do with placemaking and why we even have federal money to do this kind of work.
Yeah, good question. So my role really started as a grantee. So I came in from the outside back in 2011. Also, when I started running Station North, I was one of I think the first round of grantees in the NEA's National Endowment for the Arts Our Town program. And back then, that's when the term creative placemaking was first dreamt up to, I'd say, really describe work that had been going on for a very, very long time before that. And the definition and the way it was described changed over the years. But really, the way I often ended up describing it is that it involves artists working in collaboration with other folks on community development projects, leading towards things that don't always look like art. Artists using their creative practice to lead to positive new housing development happening or something that increases community safety or transportation options. But the artist is often involved in engagement, in organizing people, sometimes in making an actual work of art, but often in using their creative skills in some other way. And that really was a big change for the NEA, which traditionally and still, for the most part, funds art, capital A art, like exhibitions in museums and traveling theatrical productions and musical performances and all the things we often think of when we hear the word art. This was really taking that kind of creative expertise and bringing it to bear on community development work in the country. At a time that was really when the country was really recovering from the Great Recession, 2008, 9, 10, those years, that's around when that kind of work
Yeah.
formally started. It, of course, was happening before then. But my role was as director of design and creative placemaking, overseeing that grant program, design grants for design nonprofits, all forms of design around the country, overseeing the Mayor's Institute on City Design, a training program for mayors on urban design and planning principles, a
Uh-huh.
similar program called the Citizens Institute on Rural Design, which was a counterpart training rural leaders on those same principles, and a whole bunch of other things that I could also go into.
And what's happening now with that funding?
In theory, it's still moving forward. Everything is in flux, certainly at the federal level now. That's kind of an understatement, I suppose. But the program still exists. The Art Town program has been folded into a larger grant program at the NEA. Grants for Arts Projects is kind of the bread and butter program there. So it's one of the different disciplines, which includes visual arts and theater and music and opera and many other different disciplines. So the Art Town program or creative placemaking program is now part of that. But there is still funding. There are definitely restrictions as to the kinds of projects that are being funded, but it is still there in theory.
And so one of the things you said that was really interesting is that you were funding like artist projects, performances, other things like that, as well as like community wide initiatives. And before when you were talking about the work you did in Baltimore, it was really about bringing people together. And what I find here in Michigan is that there's a lot of individual projects that are being funded, but there's very little at kind of the broader level, the ecosystem level, where there's funding or a grant fund or some way for people to come together and really own the whole process. So, for example, I went this weekend to a workshop on sustainable fashion in Detroit, and it was really a human centered design process to bring some key people together, but one of the things that's lacking is the public policy and the attention and really the concerted effort. Everybody in the room had gotten funding, a couple $1,000s here or there to do something. But what was missing was really that the infrastructure level. Can you talk a little bit about funding at that and level and why that's important?
In terms of funding, something beyond just the direct grants to the creative producers, but something, yeah.
Yeah, but really
Yeah,
like
the
a
real
roadmap almost. Yeah,
Yeah, I'd say, getting money to do your work is always great, of course, but there's often a what's next question, or where do you sell the work you've created, or how do you learn how to bring your work to the next level, invest in your own practice? I think that's what you're getting at, which is often a challenge. The Art Town program that I managed was mostly a or was really a project based program. So it funded individual projects. Sometimes people came back for funding for a new project, but we wouldn't fund the exact same project more than 1 year in a row. So it wasn't meant to be sustainable. But yeah, the ecosystems, letting people meet each other was something I was definitely thinking about at the National Endowment for the Arts. And we were running a technical assistance program in partnership with the actual grant funding, and wasn't perfect. It didn't create an ecosystem in every community in the country, but it was intended to create a national ecosystem where the people doing this work, who were often working in really isolated corners of their local government, they were the only ones doing this kind of work in their town or city in many cases. It gave them an opportunity to meet other people who were doing similar work, sometimes at a more advanced level or with more support in their community, and just kind of learn what they might do next to grow their own practice or find new work. But yeah, it's a little bit challenging to be working in a unique, innovative kind of way and then wrap up a project and not know where the next one is going to be.
sure. And then, what advice do you have for economic development officers in cities or rural areas or regions that are being impacted by a reduction of federal funds? And often, I mean, in Michigan, we have a constant threat of a zeroing out of funds for arts and culture organizations.
Yeah, it's a common problem at the federal level in many states and local levels as well, unfortunately. I think, well, a couple ways to answer that. One is that arts funding is surprisingly nonpartisan. I have found in my experience, certainly at the federal level, despite a lot of the threats that have happened now, looks like the NEA is going to be funded at its normal level again for this current fiscal year, and that's happened in many states as well. So I think it's often about, if you're talking to somebody who has the decision making power over that kind of funding, people connect with the arts in many different ways. It's hard to have a one size fits all persuasive approach to this conversation. Some people are really interested in dance, some people are really interested in arts education, some people were touched by musical performance at some point. Some people are interested in this interdisciplinary, collaborative, creative placemaking work and understand that approach. So the arts world is disparate and varied. And so that's often key, is to understanding the audience you're talking to and what will persuade them and which stories are useful. Because there are artists in every neighborhood, in every community, in every city in the country who are doing good work and impacting their communities in a positive way. And people in rural red states and blue big cities, I think, understand that once you get through some of the partisan disagreements.
And what argument would you make economically? Does funneling money to the arts make a difference to other industries, to communities, to economic growth?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an economic argument that has been made that I can make, many others make, and I think there's a lot of good reasons to invest in artists. It can't really be outsourced in a real way. People still do like to see things in person or to experience them online, but it still requires artists to create the work despite threats from AI. I think AI is not actually going to replace creative people entirely. It's going to supplement their work in many ways, but hard to know what the future actually holds. But I think the real benefit is the fact that investing in the arts has all sorts of other health related benefits and other things that are good for communities beyond just the economic benefit. I think everyone's aware of the kind of crisis of isolation that many of us face, and there's been an increased movement of social prescribing. It's really started in the UK and it's definitely come to the United States in terms of people who are experiencing depression or other symptoms related to isolation are being prescribed to go to arts performances, theater performances, art galleries, things like that,
The
to just
success rate
experience.
is huge, right, for that?
Yeah. I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but it seems to work well. Getting people out and about, interacting with their fellow peers, other human beings, can be really good for people. And they spend money, and there's money involved, and more insurance companies are now supporting this and covering this, and a number of universities are for their students as well. So it's economically beneficial and socially, and has a health benefit as well.
Tell me your why. Why do you continue to do this work, and why are you passionate about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I enjoy traveling. I enjoy living in different places, experiencing different places. I think there's an overwhelming homogenizing impact of a lot of economic development work, a desire, intentional or otherwise, to make places very similar. And a lot of places are quite similar at the surface level. A lot of businesses are, of course, national, and restaurants and things you can find the same in many places. And there's plenty of good reasons why doing things at scale makes sense, of course. But I think when it comes down to it, traveling from place to place, it's often the culture, and the artistic expertise in different places, and the natural environment, certainly for sure, that makes places unique. But people creating interesting things, creating unique cultures, whether it's culinary traditions or performance traditions and other things that make traveling and being in different places unique. It has an economic benefit, certainly, to differentiate one place from another, but also just makes life more interesting and worth living. And that's the kind of work that I want to support.
Yeah, and it sounds like this can happen anywhere. You just have to figure out what the resources are and bring people together and really kind of celebrate what that is and decide and create a plan and a strategy for how to do this, which I think is a really interesting thing. You can't just start a industry from scratch all the time. Except in this case, you really can bring people together and really figure out how to cultivate what already exists in creative ways to really recreate or redevelop a community.
Yeah, I often tell the short anecdote that when I ran this mural festival, Open Walls Baltimore, in Station North for a few years, people would then come to me and say, I'm from this other place, this other city somewhere in the country, and I want to do what you did here. I want to run a mural festival here. And I would often stop them and say, well, do you have muralists? Do you have talented people to do the work in your community? Or are you trying to do more of a copy and paste approach? Because I didn't just
Yeah.
dream up one day that I wanted to have a mural festival. I was approached by a muralist who had been voted by, I think, Juxtapose magazine or website as the top muralist in the country, who lived in the district, who was very connected to other muralists. And he came up with the idea, and I supported him to grow that idea into reality. And every community has someone like that, not necessarily voted as the best in their craft, but someone who is skilled at doing something. So instead of importing talent from the outside, it's often about working with the local skills that are already in your community.
Yeah. And tell me what you're doing now. You said you're consulting now. What does that mean?
Yeah, good question. I am taking what I learned in all the roles I've been talking about, the NEA at Station North. I spent a number of years doing advocacy work with Smart Growth America and Transportation for America. I'm running an arts and culture team there, bringing artists into transportation planning and other kinds of projects and communities. And working with cities, with counties, some I can't quite name yet, but starting to work on cultural plans for different communities, figuring out how to do what I've just been describing in an intentional kind of way, figure out where it makes sense to invest, what those local talents actually are in different communities, how people can find them, grow them, find the funding, the resources, make the connections I need to do some of the kind of work that I've been talking about, as well as writing some reports, policy reports on how some states can do this kind of work better. There's a real interest in supplementing the lack of funding that is coming from the federal government. In many cases, people have made a lot of progress in cities and want to keep that progress going during these more lean times when there's not as much federal funding to go around. So I've been supporting communities to do that kind of work as well.
And if someone wanted to get hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
They can go to my website, which is stonestrategies.llc. That's my new consulting practice. And they can find all my contact information there. They can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here and for doing this podcast with us today. We really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.